I'm glad to be back in Kansas City. I love Kansas City. It reminds me a lot of Indianapolis. I'm not from Indianapolis, but 50 miles south in Bloomington. But they're both cities with a lot of character, a lot of wonderful fabric, and the surrounding region, which is quite beautiful, I think. Similar topography, rolling hills, lots of green, pretty lush, and so I feel quite at home in a place like this. I have a great deal of respect and admiration for the work that Kathy Boyer-Sheshel has done here in the area, as well as Marlene and Jean and other folks, and Julie I met last night, and Mary over in Mary in Independence. Just a lot of stuff going on here in the area, and the creation of the professional network for communities for all ages, I think, is an indication of the level of interest and activity that we see around here. And I congratulate all of you for joining this network, because you have the foresight to realize that this is important now as we speak, and it becomes increasingly important with every year that goes by until about 2050. So congratulations, and thank you for inviting me here. This is being recorded, I think, and videotaped, so I'm going to start with somewhat of an apology, because some of these slides I kind of slapped together in the recent past and have not put adequate attributions on some of the photos. So it makes me a little nervous to see that it's going to be published, but I'll go back and try to do that. Hopefully the AP won't come after me next week for showing a photo, from their collection. Let's see. One of the issues that we have to contend with, I think, is just our own relatively inadequate thoughts about aging, as part of our humanity. We still suffer from this cult of youth, as reflected in the painting of Father Time cutting down youth. It's no mistake that Father Time has a scythe when he's represented, because he cuts us down. And the envy that we have of youth still influences the way we think about communities and the way we think about design, and it's kind of unfortunate in a way. And the public images that we see of aging in the media and Madison Avenue publicity, as represented in the second photo, leave us a little short. I think most people really don't aspire to this lifestyle of, running on the beach. And that's really not what most ordinary people are looking for. We also have this problem with the fragmentation, not only of the individual body of older people that's broken into parts so that we have specialists for each part of our body, but there's a similar force going on in the way I think we've fragmented our communities over the years, and lost perspective on some of these more fundamental questions regarding aging and our place in the world. It has led us to develop systems that reflect that model of aging, with that focus on aging as a kind of a medical concern. And we spend billions, if not trillions of dollars in a system that's focused on acute care, on diagnosis, on care, rather on cure. As you can see, we've invested a huge amount of money in this particular system. If we were to think of aging from a different perspective, think of aging in terms of a community rather than our individual bodies, we would have a healthcare system that would look significantly different. It would focus on chronic care and aging as a natural process rather than as a medical problem. Would focus on the quality of remaining years and care and prevention. And instead of thinking of people as patients, we would be thinking of them as community members. And in thinking in terms of the work that we need to do, it involves community building and not building medical care systems. When I worked at the hospital in Bloomington, and we used to ask older people coming in, what do you want the healthcare system to do for you? Inevitably, they would say, well, I would like it to help me manage at home as long as I can. And I know that resonates with a lot of you when you think about your own future or the future that your parents or grandparents are looking forward to. So older people themselves have an innate sense of identity between the concepts of health and home and community that's really not recognized by the healthcare system. So I think we've been asking the wrong question all along. We think of age in chronological terms. We get into conversations about when is old age? Is it 65? Is it 75? Is it 85? I think that's the wrong question. The question is not when is old age, but where is old age? In other words, if we can think of aging as a kind of a geographic phenomenon and not a medical phenomenon, I think it'll move us in a different direction. So I've come to believe that aging is not about time and the individual body, but it's about relationships and the meaning of place, which is why this group assembled today is especially adept and insightful about issues of place and geography and community. So you really are the carriers of this new approach to aging. In the disability community, this notion has floated around for quite a while. This is a classic article that suggests that health and disability and aging refer to the balance between personal capability and environmental demand. So if you think of yourself you're in a wheelchair, right, and you go up to the old Carnegie Library, there's no ramp, just a set of steps, you're disabled, right? If there's a ramp there, you can go on up, get a book, read to a child or whatever. Who's to say you're disabled? Where is the disability after all? Is it in the person or is it in the relationship with the environment? So disability, aging, health exist in that relationship between our bodies and the environment. It takes disability, it takes health, it takes aging out of the body, so to speak, out of body experience, if you will. That's where it exists. Which suggests that disability and health and aging are issues of politics, aren't they? They're political issues. They're issues of society and not issues of individual bodies. Wendell Berry, my favorite author, says it much more eloquently. He says, community is the smallest unit of health. Community is the smallest unit of health. And I think of that as a kind of a sensitizing concept, one that challenges us to think about health in a different way. So where is health? Is it in the body or is it in the relationship between the body and the community? So it suggests that aging is not a personal problem, but a community challenge. And we've got a lot of work to do because we tend to, the discourse about aging in our country is that if you're successful, it's a matter of individual overcoming. And we put up heroes and poster children and older people jumping from airplanes and things like this, as if conquering old age had something to do with individual overcoming. If we think of aging not so much as a personal individual issue, but as a community challenge, again, it takes us in different directions. And one of the problems is we've separated these qualities and aspects of life into different compartments. And older people have sort of followed along. We put children in one place, we put old people in another. We put shopping in one place, we put work in another. So again, we fragmented our communities and lost track of a sense of community that thinks of it as something that is whole rather than fragmented. It makes a difference, the way we think about these things in terms of public spaces. St. Petersburg, Florida, back in the 1940s and early 50s, the main street in St. Petersburg was quite an active, vital place. And you can see it's kind of lined with these benches. And the benches were painted green. That's why it was called the City of Green Benches. If I should attribute the work here to Maria Vesperi, who's a cultural anthropologist who did an ethnography study of St. Petersburg quite a few years ago and found these pictures. Tells the story about the green benches. By the 1950s and early 60s, this was a hoppin' place for retirees. It was a mecca for retirees, and you can see that Main Street, lined with these benches, was a terrific sociable environment. People had a ball. And of course, the stores, as you can see, stayed open to 9 p.m. because they had a lot of customers in the neighborhood. Unfortunately, the JCs in St. Petersburg decided that they did not want to be the prune capital of America, as they said. They wanted to be seen as a vibrant, youthful kind of community. And so they had this big idea that they would take these benches and warehouse them, okay? And that would get rid of this image that they have as a, a retirement mecca, a city for old people. And of course, what they did was essentially kill the street. It's still inhabited by older people, individual elders. It's a pretty bleak environment. I'm sure the stores don't stay open till 9 o'clock anymore along that street. I have one additional slide that was taken in the 80s by a student of mine that I couldn't find, but it's a bench that had returned to this street in St. Petersburg. And so they were waking up a little bit to the fact that in order to be an effective street, it needed places to sit, where people could socialize. Some of you may be familiar with this definition of a great places by the Project for Public Spaces in New York City. It's a wonderful organization. It's probably 30 years old now. And I find this chart useful as a way of thinking about what are the components of a good place. And it suggests that 4 of the major components are sociability, uses and activities, comfort and image, and access and linkages. Those are the parameters along which we could define what a good place might be, a good public place. In the second row are some of the intangibles associated with those qualities, and in the third row are metrics that communities can use to measure, in a sense, measure the quality of a place and evaluate a place. But I want to focus on that one called sociability there, because I think in many ways when we're talking about spaces and places for older adults in community, that sociability is a pretty key element. And I have to apologize for this long quote. But George Simmel was a sociologist, a German sociologist, published in 1910 an article on sociability. And I think it's useful because it helps us elevate the value of sociability in our lives. I can't see this on my own slide here unless there's a way to do that. But for Simmel, sociability is the art or the play form of association related to the content and purposes of association in the same way as art is related to reality. In his notion, sociability is an egalitarian form of interaction because in a sociable environment, you suspend external reality and some of the associations that you might have with external reality, and enter into a kind of an egalitarian interaction where you're both equal and your status outside of that interaction doesn't really matter. When I was doing my research in a small town in Indiana on what it was like to grow old in a small town, I spent day after day in the coffee shop in the morning with the old guys, the Romeos in the coffee shop. And it was a classic form of sociability in that all of the characteristics they brought from the outside world that made a difference in the outside world were sort of suspended for the purpose of this interaction in the coffee shop. We had a banker who would from time to time come into the interaction and didn't really get it. And so there'd be this sociable conversation going on, and he would say something to brag about a boat that he owned. In other words, he was bringing an exterior status difference into the conversation, and the atmosphere just collapsed at that point. So it was no longer sociability. So sociability is a very important form of interaction, and I think we can design places that enable and support sociability. The other point, a major sort of fundamental point I want to make, has to do with the notion of well-being in old age. And again, sometimes we think of well-being as running on the beach. Marion Barnes, who's a professor of social work in the United Kingdom, done a lot of research on the notion of well-being in everyday life among older people. And the phrase that she uses to describe what people are looking for is that they just want to be well enough. They want to be well enough. And a lot of that well-being emerges from relationships. So it's a relationship-based notion of well-being. Again, it's not located in the sort of the body, but in our relationships with other people. And that older people benefit, since they're losing relationships sometimes by virtue of distance of family or by loss of family members, that they find comfort in being in environments where relationships can develop. And I'm not necessarily talking about intimacies, although that's wonderful, but I'm talking about the casual exchange with the person at the cash register or the person on the bench at the bus stop. Those become very, very valuable sources of well-being for older people in their ordinary lives. I had a friend named Milton Figgin. I need to keep tab of my time here, I know. Okay. I had a friend named Milton Figgin who's in Bloomington. He died at age 90. I knew him probably the last 5 years of his life. And he had emigrated to Bloomington to be near his daughter. And he was a fascinating guy. Kind of looked like Albert Einstein. Can you imagine a big bush of gray hair? And he thrived on relationships. And this is a quote from him. He says, "There are all kinds of ways of being diminished, but life can teach us how to approach the end of our lives. And how can I do that unless you take elder people and shuffle them in like cards? A deck of cards with people of all ages, not put them in a corner and call it the elder place. That's my critique, and if some miracle would come and you could do it in Bloomington, and I'm still here, I want to be a part of it." He thrived on relationships. When he went to the grocery store, he would, even though he could probably walk through the store, he'd get one of these little electric carts, because that put him on the same level with young kids and babies. And he said, "Babies are my best friends." So he thrived in that environment. He was kind of an amateur artist. What do you call amateur artists? They're say. Yeah, it's kind of an outsider artist, and I won't go into his painting style. It was pretty interesting. But he had a little gallery, and he put a sign on his front window of the Barefoot Gallery, the Barefoot Museum, and people would come in and see what he was up to. And he would take a walk each morning. Sometimes he'd go to the hospital to eat lunch, met all the people that worked in the hospital cafeteria, so when he went into the hospital, everybody knew Milton. They wanted to go up and say hi to him. It was, a perfect situation. When he walked downtown, he found a path that was relatively flat up to one point, but then the square was one level above where he would be. And so he discovered that in the parking garage of the bank, there was a little elevator that would take you up to the bank. So he would go into the parking garage, get on the elevator, it would take him up to the courthouse square, and then he could walk over to the Bakehouse Cafe, where he would always sit in the window with the New York Times. And he was such an interesting looking guy, people just gravitated towards him. So he was very adept at building relationships and sustaining relationships. The physical environment and his ability to manage and navigate that environment was pretty important. So this was Milton's life. He participated in this round of conversation. And conversation in its origin means sort of turning about with someone. When you think about it, it suggests that conversation there's almost a physical quality to conversation that's important, and it's sort of going around with one another. So I think the physical designs that we come up with and the planning that we do in environments can do a lot to support sociability and to support this notion of being well enough. So how do you promote sociability? Well, one thing you could do would be to provide places where people can come together in their ordinary life on a regular basis. So congregating mailboxes and doing it in an artistic fashion, obviously, helps as well. The one on the left there, I wouldn't call that a very sociable mailbox. Yes. It's in Kansas? Is that in Kansas? I don't know. Yes. Obviously, looking for ways to simply populate places through design becomes pretty important. And I would ask you which place would you gravitate towards? I think there's a reason why there's nobody in the space on the right, and there's a lot of people in the space on the left. In fact, this is maybe a good point to allude to the difference between space and place. Space is sort of the geographic parameters, the meridian and the lines that define where we are. place is something different. And the cultural geographer Yifu Tuan was the one that sensitized me to this. And he says, a space becomes place when it partakes of the human encounter. So when space is filled with people and filled with meaning, then it becomes place. And the thing on the right there, I would say, is more like space than place, as opposed to the one on the left. Places that are static versus places that are novel. This was an image I found that I thought sort of suggested stasis to me. I mean, it's sort of there. You don't know when it came. You don't know how long it's going to be there. It's pretty boring, pretty static. You come tomorrow, it's going to look the same way. However, if we can design places that are novel, where you can expect something different the next day or the next week, then it's going to be more of a magnet for people. This is a project in the Netherlands where they just put together, they crafted these orange boxes, cardboard boxes, and created this structure out of the boxes. And when you put lighting on the boxes at night of various kinds, it changes the entire appearance. Now people can also come and reconstruct the structure with the boxes, so that you could have a different structure every day. And so again, if you're a resident of that neighborhood, you want to come down there to see what it's going to look like the next day. So that becomes another quality of a place, whether it's static or novel. Seating is critically important. I've been on a quest for the elder-friendly bench for a long time, and the one on the left there is a disappointment to me because that's on Kirkwood Avenue in Bloomington that leads down to campus. And I suppose the street was sort of yuppified about 20 years ago, and these were the benches they put in, which are totally inappropriate. And I don't think I have to explain why. It's important to know that they're inappropriate not only for older people, but for little children, toddlers. You're not going to put a toddler on that bench and give them something to, because there's nothing to hang on to or explore. The bench on the right is one of the favorites. This is an AP photo that I found. It's in North Carolina, and it's a whittling station right downtown. These old guys come in probably from the country on Saturday morning or every morning, who knows, and whittle and talk and chat. And what a wonderful place to be. And it's interesting that it's the responsibility for this space is the Parks and Rec Department and not Public Works, which says something about the way they think about seating, that it becomes a part of quality of life and not just sort of infrastructure. Memory. I think it's possible to build places that contain memory or that generate memory over time. The picture on the left is a kind of a college square, which seems to me devoid of memory. I think if I went to that college and I was on that space, I would have a hard time recollecting it. There's just no features to speak of that, you know, that bring memories forth. Whereas in the right-hand picture, although it's a private space and not a public space, you can see there are features in that environment which provoke and support memory, and not just the picture of Marilyn Monroe there, but also the jukebox on the wall, which is something I love because that's another way of accessing memory. And just having ephemera on the walls that changes from day to day is an important way to add memory, if you will, to a place. I think a good place remembers itself to itself. That's a hallmark of a good place. And age composition is another important thing to think about in designing public spaces. I don't have anything, I'm not opposed to teenagers hanging out. I think it's a necessary part of teenagehood, you know, that you got to hang out. And kids need places to hang out, but we also need environments that all ages can hang out. That's probably not the best picture of an intergenerational interaction that I could find, but I thought it was sort of interesting with a kid on the chair with his great grandma. So age composition, risk is an important feature or quality of places that can push away or invite people to participate in that particular place. And so looking at public spaces in terms of risk for sort of ordinary inhabitants, not designing them for the most robust individuals in the community, but designing them for small children, designing them for frail elders, becomes an important feature of a place. Sensory experience, another really critically important quality of a place that will enable it to draw people. It's all about drawing people into the place to participate in sociability. Some places are rich with sensory experiences, and some are not. I was going to bring a poem, I forgot to bring it with me, of an elderly woman in Bloomington who wrote a poem about her memories of childhood growing up around stockyards of Chicago. And talk about a sensory experience. These sensory, the smell of the stockyards and all of the other features that went along with the stockyards was just a very rich part of her own experience and her own memory. So are we creating environments that people are going to remember? And when an environment has some degree of synesthesia, which means that it ties into all your different senses, then it's more likely to be enjoyed, enriching for people, more likely to be remembered. So trying to build in a variety of different sensory experiences into places, I think, becomes very important. Another intangible, planners get in trouble sometimes when they try to define this, but beauty becomes a very, very important quality of a place that attracts people. And this is the same building dressed up on the right. It's almost unrecognizable as the building on the left, but suggesting of the way that we can, again, enrich spaces through beautification. Beautification used to be such a significant part of city planning, and I don't know if people are still using the term or whether we're rediscovering it, but it's just so important. Challenge becomes an important feature of an environment. I think this is a kind of an interesting one because sometimes our efforts are involved with designing environments that are not challenging, that are prosthetic, and that are easily accessible without any effort whatsoever. And that, of course, is important, particularly for people with disabilities, whether they're children or adults or elders. But I think sometimes we miss the possibility of creating environments that have some degree of challenge in them. Elizabeth Bridgewaters in Bloomington was an old woman who lived across from the community center. And I have a lot of stories about Elizabeth, but one thing she told us about the community center was where the meal program was, that as she looked out across the street at the community center, there was a set of WPA steps leading up to the old community center, which was a 1930s building. Around the back was a ramp. And she said, you know, it's good because some days I'm feeling pretty good and I want to go up the steps. And other days I feel like I need to use the ramp. And I think that's a very, very important comment about, first of all, the nature of disability, that it's not either or, that you feel good one day, you don't feel so good the next day. It's an evanescent kind of an experience. But what she was experiencing was the principle of choice that was built into that environment. She liked going, people enjoy challenges that they can overcome, because that makes you feel good. You've got a challenge, you take the challenge, you overcome, that gives you a great sense of satisfaction and well-being. So we want to design environments that are challenging but not overwhelming. And one of the ways to do that is to build choice into that environment so people can kind of go their own way and be challenged if they want to, or be in a more prosthetic environment if they need that. Blue zones. You may have heard of blue zones. One of the features of blue zones where people have great longevity in different places around the world. People live, to be very, very old. One of the common threads of those blue zones is that they're in environments with a lot of topography, and movement and challenge, if you will, is a part of everyday life. just to walk about your community, walk about your town. So building those challenges in can really physically promote longevity, in my opinion. So when we talk about age-friendly communities, there are a lot of important, significant issues around housing, around transportation, social inclusion, respect and social inclusion, communication and information issues that we need to address when we're doing age-friendly community planning, community and health services, social participation, and civic participation. And I think all of these issues in some ways have some connection to public spaces, the issue of public spaces. Housing, for example, is very much an issue of public spaces because where you locate housing is a critical issue to consider in trying to build housing that works for people and allows them to be members of the community that they want to be members of. It's also a transportation decision, isn't it? When you build housing with access to social spaces, intergenerational, rich, vibrant social spaces, you've also solved a transportation issue. So these are all issues of public space, and public participation, of course, is also an issue in designing public spaces. So as part of the process of designing public spaces, participation, I think, is a critical element, because that's how we really find out how people use space, what to them is place as opposed to space. Participation provides a collaborative process by which community inhabitants reach common goals, engage in collective decisions, and create places. And these places, in turn, serve as material expressions of their collective efforts. So a place reflects the contributions of people who have come there. And the intangibles of these spaces which make them place are as important as the infrastructure, and the concrete and the tie rods and all of the other things that go into creating public spaces. These intangibles become very important. And the only way to really learn about these intangibles and how we can infuse public spaces with these intangibles is through public participation. If we do this right, we can look back at our community and see old people everywhere. This is not my phrase. This is Christopher Alexander, an architect, wrote a very influential work called Pattern Language a number of years ago with colleagues. And this was one of his core principles of community, which was in a good community, you see old people everywhere. And it's also a metric if you think about it. When you walk around town, you go into the grocery store, you go into this place or that, do you see old people? And there are a lot of places one can imagine you would go where you might not see old people. And there's something wrong with that. I think the same thing can be said about children in our lives. And I offer this from Cat Stevens, whose name is Yusef Islam now, that we could ask of all public places, where do the children play? And if we ask that of all places and can answer that question, then we're doing a good job. So if you go into a nursing home, where do the children play? You go into a grocery store, where do the children play? You go into a public space, where do the children play? If we can continually use that metric and also see old people everywhere, I think that we can do a good job in creating a community for all ages. Again, Wendell Berry, I think a good community is one where the forces are moving inward, not outward. I think in communities where we're not doing a good job, there are these forces that are spinning people out. Lack of job opportunities, lack of an ability for older people to stay in their neighborhood. All these forces at work that are spinning people out of their neighborhoods and out of their communities. And it's a centrifugal force. And what Wendell Berry is suggesting is that we reverse those forces and think of ways that we can pull things together. How can we bring people together into environments where they can benefit from community? And a human community, if it is to last, must exert a kind of centripetal force, holding local soil and local memory in place. And so I want to stop there. As you probably have realized, I'm not an urban planner. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a policy wonk. I'm an anthropologist and mostly interested in how people, use spaces, how people engage in community. And but I think that's a good baseline for any discussion about public spaces and what kinds of spaces we want in our communities. So I'm going to stop there. We have maybe 5-10 minutes for questions, or do you want to? I've lost track of the agenda. Comments, questions? Yes, please.
It seems there should be a relationship between our governmental elected officials, state level and local level, and what you're talking about. In my opinion, today, we don't have that in Kansas. The governor is not a social, engaging person in politics. The legislature sure is. Talking about welfare and all the rest of it. So what can we do to spur on more engagement in better places, not spaces in our community?
Yeah, I think a lot of our systems sort of shut out effective public participation. If you think of a hearing in City Hall and wanting a citizen to come say something at a hearing, it means they've got to stand before a podium, look at an audience of maybe relatively subdued reactions, 5 or 6 officials. It's a series of monologues. The next person comes up, the next person comes up, the next person comes up. So it's a series of monologues rather than a dialogue. And as Daniel Kemmis would say, there are a lot of public hearings, but not a lot of public listening. And so the techniques that we've developed for public participation are sort of the baseline, if you will. It's kind of like ADA. You got to do this minimum. You got to put the legal in the paper. You got to make it a public meeting. You have to advertise it. And if you want to be engaged, this is how you have to do it. And that's fine. That's important. But that cuts out so many different people who would be very uncomfortable speaking at a podium, but may be very talented in, who knows, graffiti, and could be asked to turn those artistic talents into some expression of what kind of a community they would like to live in. Using all the arts and humanities that you can imagine to engage in public participation is a valuable way of clarifying and articulating what the values of a community might be, and then trying to plan around those values. I think another problem is boundaries, jurisdictional boundaries, because I think a lot of planning doesn't really relate to neighborhoods, felt places where people feel they belong. So it doesn't necessarily correspond with a jurisdictional boundary. And so I'm guessing it would be difficult sometimes to bring people together around a jurisdiction. It's kind of like defining age by chronology. It's like defining place by a geographic boundary only. It's going to set up a certain degree of difficulty, I think. Okay, well, I will shut up and turn the podium over to Scott. See if I can get rid of these slides here.
So I was a big fan of George Simmel in grad school. But I think that there's something, I would take what Phil's saying one step further and say there's something particularly unhelpful about drawing a distinction between place and public. And I think something, this idea of how space evolves, to have an idea that the public evolves in some way different, or that somehow the public is different than that kind of attachment in space, is the beginning of a very problematic journey. And in a way, age-friendly cities, this is the World Health Organization's model of age-friendly cities, their organizational chart. We're going to spend some time this summer thinking what this should be. This is, I think, the worst organizational chart ever invented for many reasons. One is that what you just heard about Phil talking is how every single one of these domains in these sort of separate categories is necessary to consider when you cite a bench in the public. But that bench only falls into one of these categories. But it's actually impossible to cite a bench well without touching on all of these things at once. And then the other failure of the age-friendly organizational diagram is that everything has to come back to the age-friendly group. And ideally what you want is transportation and housing to be having regular conversations on their own and at such a volume that you could never run them all through age-friendly. So one of the things we're going to be thinking about this summer is that organizational chart. Now, I want to talk about some of the very same stuff Phil talked about, but really try to focus now on something much simpler, which is the relationship of the automobile to your public buildings and your main street. This, I think, is critical to all the work that you all are doing. Understand that from the period of about 1955 to about 1975, 30% of the nation's gross domestic product was the production of automobiles, streets, oil, all the things that go along with automobiles. 30% of what we did in the post-World War II boom was build for the automobile and fuel that automobile. It's astounding. It reshaped the entire way we related. It turned our neighborhoods into these sorts of cul-de-sacs where Dad went to work somewhere else during the day, and the front yard was mainly a place for kids to play football and was supposed to be very safe, protected from traffic. The backyard became the kind of place that Phil showed us as benches and Main Street. The whole idea of that kind of social relationship transferred during this 20-year period to backyards for a long period of time. Now, when that happened, that was it created an interesting situation, both spatially, but also the nature of how we related. In order to have a social gathering in a backyard like that, you didn't just show up, right? You had to be invited. So suddenly it was structured. Much more of our social relationships now are structured. They're play dates, they're appointments. They're not bumping into someone on the street as much as they used to be. In addition, these were privatized spaces. These are backyards, so you're only coming in there if you've been invited. So I suddenly am not running into people other than me, other than people like me and my neighbors. I highly recommend for anyone getting into age-friendly work looking at this movie called The Swimmer from 1968. It was a John Cheever story made into a film, and it is just a brilliant sort of a baseline of where we are today. What happens is the hero is at a party, one of these backyard parties in Connecticut, and he realizes he can swim home by swimming pools, that they form a virtual river through the community in these backyards. And he goes and he swims his way home. And in each backyard there's a party going on, and it's vignettes, and all of them, it's a John Cheever story, so all of them are despair. There's always something quite wrong about the loss of something or other. But you go through these vignettes of community. Very interesting sort of picture of backyards in this post-50s era. All these things were going on now in these private spaces and pools that used to be much more social. And at the same time, this is what happened to our main streets when we built for the cars. Main Street, and I know Raytown is beginning to look at this, but retail switched entirely from destination, meaning I went downtown to buy stuff and see people and pick up some postage stamps and maybe stop in at the courthouse. Downtown was a destination activity. With the advent of the proliferation of the car, we switched to convenience retail. And the difference being the spaces out front were not spaces for people to bump into each other, just the opposite. They were advertising the amount of parking they had to convince you that you could get in, get your gallon of milk, and get out without any friction or encounter whatsoever. It was about convenience. And this completely changed our public buildings. Public spaces and public buildings were downtown, and they were in areas like this in Portland, where the intent of the space was to be popularized. It was to be peopled. It was a place for people. The switch to convenience retail, which is, I know what Raytown is dealing with, was an enormous transformation in our society. So 30% of GDP, I want to keep coming back to that, because if nothing else you get from today, it's an understanding that what we're involved with age-friendly communities is not a small thing. I'd be very frustrated if someone went home and they thought that making a curb cut different made them an age-friendly community. We're about a big shift in about rethinking how we relate to our environment. So when we did that, when 30% of the nation was involved in producing automobiles, the thing to remember is that this was hard work. Right? There was nothing involved in this that was a good desk job. There were very few PowerPoints about this. It was actual labor, not what I do. And the other thing to remember is that labor was the first time done by organized labor. This was union activity. Almost everything involved in that 30% of GDP was unionized. It was the first time we had a blue collar that had a career that was protected with a pension that was guaranteed. So what we had was blue collar for the first time entering into a retirement with money to spend. And when they ended their 25 years, this is what a retirement party looked like in the late 50s, the very next step was this. Whew. You know, you actually worked hard. And so leisure for the past 30 years has defined the way we thought of the older years. This was people that labored, that had money to spend, and cost of living was not so high. So when you were done, you had the opportunity to hang out for a while. And that became our definition of age-friendly. This, Sun City in Arizona, was the first age built just for aging. And a number of things to note about it is that it's a walkable distance. It could have been a walkable distance. It's lined by golf. It's lined by leisure. And interestingly enough, though this is scaled like probably any Italian hill town, it's of that size. The retail in the center is not destination retail, it's convenience retail. That I am going to get in my car and I'm not going to walk to the downtown. I'm going to drive to this collector. I'm going to go down to an arterial where I'm going to be able to see that there's ample parking out front and that I will be able to get in, get my milk, and get out without any friction. So that was the idea of what age-friendly became. Still convenience, not engaged, still backyard and golf, but it's still auto-dependent. So here we are today. Our challenge now is not building roads. We know already that by 2020, 30% of what we will do as a nation will be healthcare. Healthcare expenses are climbing logarithmically, driven mostly by something very closely related to automobile environments, chronic disease. Chronic disease, people, particularly sedentary lifestyles, are the big driver of health expense. And what we see in this slide is that you can predict that about every 10 years, the cost of managing chronic diseases will close to double. So we're into a big shift. And I think that if you can imagine Main Street in 1939 and the way our neighborhoods built around it and the way we related to it, and then by the mid-50s, how much, in early 60s, how much we had reshaped that environment in the post-war around the car. We will need to see a similar degree of change in the next couple decades. We will be in a change period. And this is what people are looking at, is how do you keep people more engaged, the social engagement, the ability to bump into friends casually, not make all of these things help with our medical expense enormously. They make us much less dependent on medical treatment and put us much more into the kind of environment that actually sustains our well-being. And thankfully, whereas we spent a tremendous amount of money gearing up for this new endeavor, we were not a mortgaged out country in post-war period. We had money to burn and we built and built and built with new capital expenditures. What we're looking at now is fortunately much cheaper. It will be cheaper for us to move than to sustain the infrastructure we have built in the previous decades. So we're gearing up now for a savings model, not a giant new rollout model. This image is something that Joe Minicosi is now doing. If you look in the flat plane, that is an outline of Lafayette, Louisiana, the city. And what you see projecting downward in red is portions of the city that are revenue negative, and projecting up in black are places that are revenue positive. So in everywhere that's projecting down in red, that means that neighborhood, that property is costing the city much more to support than it is generating in tax revenue. Where it goes up, those are the places that are carrying everywhere else. What you see is the old style, the biggest spike there is Old Lafayette, it's downtown. It looks exactly like the Main Street I showed from Portland. And then what you see out on the side is a new urban community called River Ranch built on that same principle, also spikes. So the point being here is that what you can look at what we built in that auto-dependent realm, it is extraordinarily expensive for municipalities to maintain that infrastructure. It is not a cost-effective model. So our big money is not a giant new rollout now. All we have to do is look cheaper than sustaining the sprawl we built. And so age-friendly communities will undergo some transformation simply because they're good investment to do so. And I think that when you think about this organizational chart, get away from thinking small, understand what you're in now is of the scale of this big movement towards building the car system. 20 years of 30% of American gross domestic product. That's the scale you need to be thinking about. And you need to be thinking about it because that's the savings we're going to accrue by doing this, not the expense of a new rollout. And then think about the force that's going to drive this. And every time there's a big change, there's a force that drives it. Unions, in many ways, were what drove the automobile industry. Not so now. Unions are getting progressively weak. What is the giant force in all city building right now? What everyone talks about is boomers and millennials. The consumer market, particularly, of boomers and millennials. What this is showing is not the complete population, but the periods in a person's life between age 20 to 29 is when they're most mobile and when they're making investments that are pre-children and likely going to then fix them in a place where they're going to spend money. Right? Same with boomers. Boomers are thinking through, between 50 and 59, they're beginning to think through their next steps when they're most likely to put down roots and make investments that lead to their next few years. So these are the very mobile years where there's big spending going on. That convergence is going to be hitting its peak next year. So we will see 88 million boomers and millennials will be in their peak period of change years next year. So whereas we have the Teamsters on the left here, I tend to think of being a Generation Xer, I think of these as our modern day Teamsters. They are in cahoots, I think it's organized, and I think there's racketeering going on. I'll be honest about that. I don't like it. But what we know is there's heading in a good direction, and one that's very complementary to age-friendly communities. We know that many of them want to move, they don't want to stay still. This is new. Whether it really happens or not, we don't yet know. But we know that all of them are moving to more urban locations, not urban necessarily skyscrapers, but urbanized as in like a Main Street. They want entertainment, they want more compact, walkable environments. And the evidence of this, and this is from when I was working with DPZ, we worked in a lot of rural towns, this one being Monroe, Louisiana. Nothing was happening yet in the Monroe downtown. The very first thing, and it happened while we were there working, the very first thing to go into their sort of abandoned downtown was this, a place called Cotton. It's a $40 a plate restaurant. It's the first thing in. And what it is, it's a hip new place. It's all envisioned by millennials. It's all run by millennials. The chef is a millennial, but there's not a millennial in Monroe that can afford to eat there. This is all underwritten by boomers and patronized by boomers. And we're seeing this time and again. The old adage that you're downtown, after the malls came and it hollowed out downtowns, the first ones in were the tattooed crowd, and they would have a nightclub, and then after a little while you'd get a burrito shop, and then a few years later maybe you'd get something edible at some restaurant, and it would sort of bring the neighborhood back up. We're seeing just the opposite right now. That downtown's the revitalizing force is this partnership between boomers and millennials. They both want a cool place downtown, and they'll start not with the hole in the wall, but with the $40 a plate restaurant. And this is happening in Mobile, Alabama too. I have now a whole collection of these that have opened in Mobile. So, big force, big change is coming. Now again, let's revisit this automobile thing. It is unbelievable to me with the ADA that this is the case in every state. This is a standard line in every charter for every DOT at the state, is that you have not only the right as the DOT, but an obligation to deny a license to drive it for any cognitive, physical impairment whatsoever. My friend has epilepsy, and if he has a seizure, it's 2 years before he can drive again. His license gets taken, and that's just standard practice. The idea that you could build a community that was only accessible and only cater for the automobile, and then you can take away the right to drive for disability seems very odd that we've put so much effort into that half-inch threshold at the door and whether that prevents a wheelchair from getting in. You can't even get to downtown now in most places in America without a car. You can't get there at all. Forget about the threshold, you just can't get there. So proximity is going to be the focus of most universal design effort. Just how do things relate spatially? And when you're relating for a universal design, I'm not going to go over all these, but here are the highlights down below. That understand about the 19% of the population at any given point in time is disabled. That doesn't mean that 19% of the people are affected by disability. That means at any point in time, you could have a disability and be part of that 19%. So the disabled class, the legal class, is time shared. We go in and out of ability. It's not a distinct group of people. It's something we all move through or have someone we're caring for that move through. Another thing remarkable about the ADA is that 78% of the folks qualifying for disability are over the age 65. Very little of the ADA has to do with age-related disabilities. Almost all of it's driven by what are called developmental disabilities, disabilities you've had since the time you were 18, a wheelchair, for instance. And the mechanism through which the ADA guidelines are set up reflect that. You have to go through a very long consensus process to affect those guidelines. So as we get into much more of the universal design, we have to unlearn everything we know right now about what it means to prepare for disability, because most of it is just flat out wrong. And I think it is helpful, as you all are beginning to look at disability issues, to understand some basic context issues, because it affects the way you do the details. Drives the details entirely. We had no law about the built environment other than health, safety, and welfare until the civil rights movement. The very first work we began to do in the built environment stems back to Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown v. Wade. You remember all of these. You probably don't remember Plessy. That was in New Orleans. That was just about riding in a streetcar where you could ride. But what we determined in 1964 is that the built environment, that public had to accommodate lots of people. There was a right to accommodation in public spaces. That in 1968 was translated very oddly. I mean, in many ways, the civil rights era was brought in by George Wallace standing up in Alabama and saying, not one single person will come into our university system, and then being pushed aside, and lots came in. He was, in fact, a catalyst for he stood up and said the stupid thing that people in the South knew not to say, and made it possible to overcome that attitude. Oddly enough, in 1968, you didn't have to have George Wallace standing on the stairs anymore. The stairs themselves were the barrier to public accommodation. This is a remarkable shift, and I think in many ways was a real mistake, colossal mistake, and one that your universal design efforts will need to have to work against. That idea that access is a civil right has so many difficult complications when you try to regulate a civil right in the built environment through the federal level, rather than what Ralph Nader did with the National Motor Vehicle Act. The civil rights was 64, 1966 was the National Motor Vehicle Rights, Vehicle Transportation Safety Act, and that was the first big win of the consumer protection movement led by Ralph Nader. What he ended up establishing was a way to come and affect the built environment. And I mean everything from guardrails on the highway to the way corners where crosswalks were done. All of this was done as consumer protection. And in doing that way, it had a basic consumer protection is a health, safety, and welfare action. And it blends perfectly with zoning and planning. Civil rights is not a health, safety, and welfare protection. It's an individual's right. You sue for it. And then you're denied your right, and it's someone's fault. It's not just you're protecting people or making it possible for people to live there. The civil rights platform simply works by suing and having someone be wrongly denying someone something. So it's a very bad platform. And what you have is the similar need with universal design now to what we have with national motor vehicles is we have an environment which essentially expels people when they lack certain abilities. And what we had in the time in the 1960s were cars that expelled people in certain conditions. And the Consumer Protection Act came in and made you have seat belts. They made there be guardrails on the road. They did all these things to keep people from being expelled. And it also, the consumer protection movement was very much in reaction to distorted consumerism. You have on the left there an Impala ad from the 50s, the couple dreaming about this car, which has essentially knives sticking out the back for when you're backing into a Main Street parking space. It had no safety glass, it had no seat belts. It was sold entirely by these bizarre lifestyle fantasies. And that is, in fact, how we are selling houses now. They're much less about what you'll need than about these sort of fantasies about what will happen in your life if you move in there. So universal design, I would say that a very early thing it needs to do when looking at public buildings or even at housing is begin to come up with something equivalent to this from the consumer movement. It's how do you correct for that market behavior? Well, people we know from buying houses, they like curb appeal, they like imagining the life that they could have there. They spend very little time thinking about the life they will probably have and whether that house suits them or not. So how do you have information available other than the curb appeal about that? And the result somehow in public buildings was that we have on the left here something that is entirely inappropriate, cannot happen, stairs. I can't get in there. There's no zero-step entry. That is a terrible, terrible building. This is perfect. This is the Department of Motor Vehicles just outside of Atlanta. That is a beautiful public building. I can imagine nothing better for accessibility, except for the sheer fact that I had to drive to get there, and I can guarantee you no one wants to go in there at all. No one wants to go into that box. On the left, what we see is something in an area, in a time of sedentary lifestyles and chronic disease. That stoop, that short flight of stairs, is probably one of the most effective ways to put challenge as a regular routine into your life. Those stairs will probably have more to do with keeping you able to support your own activities of daily living longer in life. That brief pulse of exercise you have to go up regularly and passively worked into your life. That will do more to keep you fit and living longer and more able to manage yourself than anything else until you can't get up them. And then you need to rethink. But don't think of those as bad for health or bad for aging. In fact, that stoop may be a very good decision to make intentionally when you're looking at an aging environment. And Phil went into this so well, I don't even want to touch on it. He's a beautiful poetic way of covering what I tend to inevitably gravitate towards dry legal stuff. But it is, in fact, disability is a community issue. Health is a community issue. And that more than anything else, when you're looking at public buildings, public spaces, whatever, as you're thinking about them in terms of age-friendly, what you should focus on is no longer barriers, not the half-inch threshold, can a wheelchair get over it, that sort of thing. You need to think about diversity of networks to the community, the interconnectedness of things, the proximity of things. The very fact that I can't get to it without driving makes it absurd that I have a zero-step entry. So as you begin to think about these things and implement them in your conference tomorrow, that moving away from the building code, which is the sort of outgrowth of this civil rights movement, towards a zoning platform is going to be a much better vehicle for universal design. And critical to it is the very first thing, the idea that from the federal level, you can write a set of guidelines for accessibility, and those are going to magically translate on the ground nationwide into an accessible environment is delusional. The first thing a community needs to do is envision the environment that is inclusive. They need to just come to a mental picture of what that looks like. Then whatever that is, you build your code to make it happen. But if you don't have it vision it first, you're going to end up like we saw last night, the most bizarre. It wasn't a curb cut. The whole sidewalk was at the level of the street, and then at the corner they raised a curb in a pie shape. And we would not have seen it. We would have tripped over it, but for the fact that people coming the other way tripped over it just before we got there, and we noticed that it was there. But these sort of absurd outcomes are trying to regulate the built environment from the federal level with a set of guidelines. It's absurd. You need to have an end of what it looks like, an end vision. And then there are very easy ways to start. Once you have the vision of your community that is universally accessible, it is very easy to, at the planning stages, when you're doing your master plan, to start saying, hey, look, there is topography right here, and that's right where the bus station is, and it's right where the bank is. So let's think about this now before we roll our code out. Let's have some ways of resolving that in the planning stages before we have the lots all subdivided. So you locate these things, you can do all this in a zoning framework. The trick is to never use the word access when you're doing it. All that's bogged down in this legal stuff. And what we have found from beginning to enact this kind of work in various localities is that you have to be very careful not to say access, because you can be sued under the civil rights platform for trying your best to do things at the local level. You have to just stay so free and clear of that. And this is the last slide. But here are the things that are not in the ADA code. These are things that, as you're looking at your public buildings and your spaces and you're thinking about universal access, these are the things which just aren't addressed in the ADA code, and they probably have more to do with whether a person can access a space, A, B, and more importantly, wants to access a space. There's nothing in ADA that says, a critical component to having accessible space is to have a space that's not repellent and appalling, right? Like that little thing. So these are things that you can address in universal design, which supplement and pretty easily stay clear of ADA legal structures. And that's it.